Hello, no surprises here. As you saw, it is time to talk about the best books I have read in 2023. So really the 11th hour by booktube standards, but I wanted to leave myself the room in case any favorites snuck in under the wire that I would have the space to talk about them. There weren't really that did, but I wanted to leave the option open. So with that being said, let's talk about my personal favorite books of the year, and you can let me know where you agree or disagree and what you loved this year as well. So I have talked about all but one of these books already during Feature Fridays, which makes sense because on Feature Fridays I talk about books that inspire conversation for me in some way, and so it makes sense that books I loved would inspire conversation. And I love that as well, this idea that I am really responding and engaging with my favorite works of the year. So with that, I will try not to dwell on them too long when you can go back and get a more in-depth analysis, but this is kind of the retrospective. That being said, we're not going into any particular order, though I am saving my favorite of the year for last. Can you guess what it is? Go ahead and lock in those guesses below if you're feeling really confident or drawn to guessing, but I'm guessing that a lot of you probably know where we're going to end up, but let's go ahead and build up to it anyway. Now, I was reviewing last year's favorite reads because it's nice to kind of get a sense of what I loved last year as well. And if you recall, last year at this time, we were in the middle of the HarperCollins strike. And we are unfortunately yet again in the midst of another strike. Now, I am late to the game on this. I fully admit this. I had been staying off of other bookish social media and really not watching a whole lot of booktube either. So that is on me, but there is currently a St. Martin's Press boycott going on in regards to some Islamophobic rhetoric that was posted by an employee. I personally do not know what employee. I honestly do not care to know what employee, because what matters to me is the lack of response from the publisher after being told that there are influencers and reviewers who feel unsafe and just wanted some level of accountability that these views don't reflect the press, and also asking for what protections they can expect in place as this employee does engage with influencers. And so this is not something I have personal experience with. I'm not in contact with any publishers, marketing, or PR teams at this point, but I very much care about the safety of fellow reviewers and people that are. And so I am just waiting for the publisher to make a statement. Why I'm bringing this up now, in addition to apologizing for videos in the past where I didn't realize the boycott was going on and featured titles from that imprint, is that it will impact one of my favorite books of the year that we will not get to talk about. And unfortunately, it is from an author that was also impacted by last year's boycott at this time. So that is what it is, and we're just going to keep celebrating the work that we love. And to go along with celebrating the work that we love, the closest I got to an entry slipping in under the wire here, and a surprise entry based on my previous experience with this author's work, and again, that reinforcement that you should keep, if you want to, reading an author, or I have had luck where maybe some of the first books from an author aren't exactly perfect for me, but I really click with later work in a really big way. And this author, Alex E. Harrow, is an example of that with Starling House. You have heard me probably kind of yell into the void about the Tower in the Once and Future Witches, or just kind of some of the choices in the 10,000 Doors of January that kept me from fully loving the book. And I didn't have any of those barriers with Starling House. As I've mentioned before multiple times at this point, I thought Starling House was her tightest work that I have read yet. It was focused, it was wry, it was engaging, and it's that kind of fantasy that exists in the real world. I almost said mortal world, like I maybe have been reading more fantasy than I really have been, but nonetheless, it is a kind of blending of the real and the supernatural, the fantastical, in a way to explore some of these bigger themes. And one of the things that really engaged me with this work was this idea of the other lands in kind of conversation with this idea of fantasy and the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we build up and the myths we build up about communities, but also the way that stories and that kind of storytelling can protect us, but also where the protection goes too far. There are a lot of layers here, and we're not dwelling in the didactic with this one. I feel like this narrative really trusts us as readers in in ways that some of the previous have not. And I promise I'm not trying to like undercut my enjoyment of this with saying that, but I honestly think it kind of emphasizes how much I responded to this one because it shows that kind of growth. And one of the things I responded to most in this one is our protagonist Opal, because she was a little bit prickly. She was kind of an unreliable narrator, but she would tell us that she was a liar and a thief outright in a way that the rest of the narrative, this idea especially of this small town, this kind of dying, deindustrialized small town, and I loved the way that the small town was explored here, it kind of obstructed where it was a liar. And so by the nature of Opal telling us up front that she's a liar, she becomes one of the most truthful people in the book, and I liked that kind of juxtaposition. And I also liked that she was a little bit wittier and drier in her humor. She was very sarcastic, and there was some good banter between her and Arthur, the owner of Starling House, this kind of fantastical and mysterious house that stands as a barrier to this kind of other fantastical, nightmarish world in some ways. And I love the way it explores generational, intergenerational trauma, especially for Opal and Arthur. There was a little bit of a slow burn romance that didn't feel overpowering. Now, I can't say for my readers who don't like romance at all that you will get the same out of it that I did, because I do like romance. So for my Mandys of the world, one of my best friends who doesn't like any romance, I don't know how well you'll respond to that angle, and you might feel like it detracts from the rest of the story. But for me, it really provided this extra layer, especially because it really emphasized this idea of finding your own people, and found family was very much a theme running throughout this, because Opal was trying to kind of make this world better for her brother, trying to give her brother a better life. And we saw the people in her life that she in some ways took for granted at the outset, and the narrative kind of showed us through bits and pieces. It kind of led us along this kind of slow growth with her and these others in her life, and realizing just how important they really were for her, and her realizing that as well. So for some, the supernatural kind of fantastical elements of this may not go far enough, because it is kind of this undercurrent, this underlining of these greater themes. It's much more about that kind of atmosphere and that setting. But as a reader who really loves to sit in that atmosphere when it's executed well, I loved this. So trying not to babble on too much, I sat down and I was like, I'm not gonna have anything new to say about these books. And to be fair, maybe I don't, but I'm already talking more than I planned to. So moving on to number 2, because this is a top 10 if I didn't already say. I know, for me, mind-blowing, because I don't like to make definitive lists, because I don't like to be pinned down. But this year, we're pinning it down. And number 2 is Knockout by Sarah MacLean. No surprise here. I have been a reader of Sarah MacLean for over a decade now, and she always knocks it out of the park. No pun intended, but really well executed, if I do say so myself. Though I did keep wanting to call this book Bombshell, which is the first in the series, to the point where I wrote it in my notes app as Bombshell when making this list initially, because it is Imogen's book, who is our explosions expert, and I expected some kind of explosion pun, but it's a little bit more visceral than that. And in a way that kind of fits, because it really is kind of about that surprise, and it fits Tommy more than Imogen, because Tommy is the one kind of knocked flat on his butt here. Very much quintessential man falls first, man falls hardest. And we see this kind of delicious cat and mouse, yes, not in the same way we saw with last year's Heartbreaker, where we have this kind of chase, but we did kind of see Imogen keep escaping Tommy's kind of field of view in a way, and being this real agent of chaos in this very ordered man's life, and kind of upsetting everything. And so we see the kind of symbolism of the explosions from the beginning, and we continue to get to explore a really fun aspect of the Sarah MacLean universe, which keeps expanding and getting grittier and more down to earth. We also have a complicated storyline with Tommy, who is part of the police force, and when he was introduced as a character, this is a fan favorite couple. This has been anticipated since the first book, so I obviously enjoyed him, but I did wonder what that angle was going to be with him being on the police force, and if we were going to kind of complicate things there, especially as the kind of corruption and the patriarchy of this world really are being fully explored. And so this is handled really really deftly, I think, especially for a historical, where there is that added layer of extra nuance to just the setting itself. But here we have a man that is born of principles in a lot of ways. His principles make him up, and he is realizing that his world isn't necessarily made up of those same principles at the same time that his world is being completely shaken by this woman. And so there is just this real back and forth between the two, but there is also this external instigator. We know I love an external instigator in just the systems in place, because we have Imogen, who is an agent basically of vigilante justice, and she can't necessarily trust Tommy because she has to work outside the bounds of the law to protect her own, and he represents the law, and just where the kind of conflict and tension there lies, especially when you start adding in feelings, because these two have been flirting for 2 books now. And I love the kind of forwardness of Imogen. We have a very proud, confident woman here who is sure of herself, and we see that surety shaken a little bit by circumstance, but she is always so incredibly strong, and that is part of what makes Tommy incredibly weak for her, which we love. So if you haven't read Tommy and Imogen's book yet, what are you doing? Get on it. But if you haven't read the first 2 yet, do that first, because you want to appreciate that slow burn. I'm not saying you won't appreciate it if you don't, but if you want that build up, if you want that tension, it's a great payoff, I promise. That being said, I fully anticipate to see you all again next year to talk about the Duchess's book, because that reveal at the end, classic Sarah MacLean, in that it is classic Sarah MacLean, and that it completely surprised me. As I've said before, me and my friend Kelsey have been texting for years at this point about what we think Duchess's book deal, what is going on there, especially because we were anticipating a reveal somewhat in the way of Never Judge a Lady by Her Cover, and it feels like MacLean is like, I know what you were expecting, I know what you were wanting, and I'm going to switch it up again. So very excited to see what we're gonna get next year. There have been no misses in this series yet for me, so glad to keep going on the ride. And then to stay in the world of romance for a bit, I have multiple romances on this list, and none of which were on the list of the Goodreads Choice Awards, so these will all be new romances for you, potentially. But We Could Be So Good by Cat Sebastian. Cat Sebastian has long been one of my favorite romance writers, and I was kind of on the fence about this one, because this was set in the 1950s, which isn't a setting I am particularly drawn to, and it is a gay romance in the 50s, which opens up this whole other can of worms, especially in how we culturally perceive the 50s, that I didn't know how I was going to respond to. And yet again, she proves that she can knock it out of the park. There is a pun there if you kind of squint, because there is baseball in the book, but I need to stop saying I'm not drawn to certain things, because actually the setting of the 50s and kind of the subversion of how we think about it in the culture and in mass media, and how mass media kind of warped and changed our idea of it, acknowledging the prejudices that were rampant at the time, the prejudices that are still rampant, while also acknowledging that it was a much different reality than we often see in those reflections. Another aspect of this book that I was kind of unsure on is that it is friends to lovers, which isn't my go-to trope, but again, knocks it out of the park. She has been one of the ones that has consistently been able to execute this trope for me, but it also took an angle I didn't anticipate, because I went into the book expecting it to be more kind of rivals to friends to lovers, because it is set at this newspaper and it follows one of the star reporters and the son of the owner of the paper who needs some help. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's kind of fumbling. And so I expected there to be a lot more tension between these two, and there really wasn't. They became fast friends very quickly. And in fact, some of the real tension between Nick and Andy at the start of the book was the fact that one of them had gotten engaged, and there was all this unrequited pining from the other. And if you like unrequited pining, or just pining, because it's definitely requited, this may be the book for you. And I just love the way it explores how they are building a life and a partnership amidst this setting that I actually came to really appreciate. Like I said, I didn't think the 50s were going to appeal to me, and I don't know that it is a particular period I'm going to spend much time in the future or be particularly drawn to, but if we get more books in this world, I will definitely be picking them up. And I just also love the fact that it shows that Cat Sebastian is branching out as an author and trying new things, and I love to support that kind of growth in authors as well, even if it is moving from, you know, what I initially fell in love with, but in the spirit of romance, she is continuing to give us much more to love. And then we have me lying yet again, because I said Starling House was probably the closest to slip under the radar, but that was a lie. It was probably The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty, which was fabulous. Everyone has been saying this year that this is fabulous, and what do you know, it was fabulous. This is a kind of classic get the gang together again romp with pirates and adventure and magic and some unquestionably evil antagonists. I love that we start with a quest. I love that we have an older protagonist who is in her 40s, I believe, and this idea that we have these adventures that have come before, and so we get this character building and world building through these references to these older adventures as well, while also setting up this promise of all these adventures yet to come. So knowing that her star is only going to shine brighter, and just what that means to have a protagonist who is fully coming into her own in midlife. I love that, and I just love the active storytelling as well. I also love the humor here. I love the breaks in the narration where they kind of squabble at each other, because it is Amina narrating her story to a scribe who is named and is a part of the narrative themselves because of that. And so there are all of these layers and questions that opens up. This is a very tight book in terms of its construction, the parallelism in it, the kind of completeness of the quest, which I didn't think we were going to complete in this, especially because so many books kind of string out. And so it sets up this larger journey for our protagonist, but we do have a very satisfying ending here. Now, is it the complete end of some of these characters and journeys? Absolutely not. But we do have a very complete story here, which is building into a larger arc, and I love being able to see all of those pieces at work, and you can see that intentionality here. This was just so much fun. I could sit back, I could trust the process, and I loved every minute of it. Next, we have our placeholder spot for the St. Martin's title. We cannot talk about it, but we'll give it this silent space to exist and be acknowledged as a favorite of the year. Moving back to books I've loved about love, another romance, An Island Princess Starts a Scandal by Adriana Herrera. I love this book, obviously, but it follows Manuela and Cora. But I love the parts of Paris that this introduces us to. It really shows us new settings within this historical framework, and I so much appreciate that, and really shows us counterculture of the time, because we are following a pair of lovers that are women, and so looking at where they are allowed to exist and be free within this world. And I love the way it explores them as women as well within the constraints of the society and within their relationships and their families, because we have Manuela, who is kind of a partier, and she is not afraid to grasp what she wants, and this is kind of her last hurrah before she is being forced into a marriage she does not want for her family's sake. And she has come to this place, well, you could argue for magic. I don't know, my brain was going there, just go with it. But also because she wants to grasp something for herself for the last time. And Cora has for herself. She has a reputation here. She has a group of friends here. She has a measure of success, both in her status and the way that she has been able to conduct business, and just what that conducting business is, and how she has made a place for herself at the table with men. And this book really explores where the wins are, and if you have to change to fit these other molds, whether that is a win, and what it means to kind of make your place in society, and whether it's worth it, and what love is worth. I thought that this was just layered and beautiful, and it explored the fullness of these two characters. It showed incredible growth for these two characters, and it wasn't love fixing things, but rather these characters fixing things for the sake of love, if that makes sense. But it's a more active thing, right? It's not pretending that love itself is this magic cure-all, but that when it's true, it can be a strong enough driver to make real change, and just what a happily ever after that is earned looks like. And again, what a happily ever after looks like in the context of this time and this world. And it acknowledges the reality of that while still letting us live in the fairy tale of the romance of it. This was a hit with me, and it was a hit with my romance book club. We have been loving the Las Leonas series, and I am also eagerly anticipating the next one as well. And then number 6, because I stopped numbering after 2, didn't I? Yellow Face by R.F. Kuang. Is this a surprise? This was the winner of the Goodreads Choice Awards, which was really exciting because when I first talked about this book earlier this year and how much I loved it, I was unsure how it was going to read to larger audiences because to me it felt like such insider baseball. So I was really excited to see that that translated to larger audiences as well because it's important, and not just because it's this kind of titillating literary drama that we have unfortunately seen bleed into reality in ways this year that really should have waited until this book wasn't a current topic to be especially prescient. But it follows June, a kind of unsuccessful, to her mind, author, especially when comparing herself to her wildly popular frenemy, Athena, who kind of burst onto the scene as a literary darling. And after Athena dies in a tragic pancake incident, yes, you heard that right, that June was the only witness to, June steals her unfinished manuscript for herself, and in the process starts to portray herself as an Asian author when she is very much a white woman, and just how far she will go to kind of achieve this idea of success that she has in her head, and how the industry enables her until her lies start getting exposed and the house of cards starts to crumble. But again, it's this kind of wry, sarcastic, dark literary thriller, but there's also a lot of dark humor in this, if you couldn't tell from the aforementioned pancake incident, but also that we are getting this story from June's point of view. So we're seeing that kind of warped justification for actions, that entitlement, and we are seeing everything layered through this incredibly unreliable narrator, and how that makes us as readers complicit in the whole thing. And so it is this really interesting commentary that is packaged as this thriller, and I think it succeeds at what it does. It's a little heavy-handed sometimes, but I think that is part of the humor as well. And again, how heavy-handed is it for people who aren't maybe as intimately aware of some of these conversations and these dramas? I don't know. So I am glad to see that it has resonated with other readers this year, but I really enjoyed this one. It was fast-paced, it was interesting, and notably, it was incredibly different from anything else we have so far seen from Kuang, and so it's showing her versatility continuing to develop in her voice, and she is so early in her career. I continue to be very interested in what else we are going to get from her. And then Changing All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, which is a sci-fi dystopia kind of looking at the prison system in America and the extreme version of that, where prisoners are given the opportunity to fight in this gladiator type system in order to win freedom, and the idea that only one person has successfully won freedom, and that was probably rigged. So we are seeing our protagonist Thurwar as she is right on the cusp of this freedom, even as it puts her at odds with her group that she is associated with in these fights, and most specifically her lover Stax, who is also kind of working up the ranks to freedom, but how this system is this huge entertainment sports complex. It's being framed as sports, extreme action sports, even though it is a blood sport. And so it's this incredibly insightful and searing social commentary kind of packaged in this kind of absurdist, but how absurdist construct that is further kind of emphasized by these academic footnotes of sorts within the book. And the style of this is incredibly interesting. As I said before in the Feature Friday for it, it really kind of leans on his strengths as a short fiction writer. If you have not read Friday Black, read it. It's wonderful short stories. But here we see a very episodic structure. We are not following Thurwar straight through. We are jumping in to other points of view in this world to kind of look at the system as a whole, and it provides this kind of dark reality, but there's also this dark humor again to it, and it's not, you know, something that's going to make you start laughing out loud in the moment, but it's this kind of wryness that forces us as readers to kind of look at where we're sitting, while also being a really complex and nuanced and layered exploration of violence and justice, and this idea that these people who have been incarcerated for violent crimes, what justice looks like there, but also this idea that they are fighting to the death for their freedom. And so the very action that took their freedom to begin with is the action that will conceivably gain their freedom if they are able to kind of win against this rigged system and just how rigged the system is. And what is the ethical distinction between a murderer and cheering for state-sanctioned murder? And so this is a kind of pulled back commentary. Like I said, it is extremely episodic. So there are these very active elements, especially when we start the book. We start the book very action focused. As a reader who can get lost in action, I actually appreciated that this didn't dwell overly much in the action and the violence, especially because I think part of it is that idea of where we become desensitized to violence. And so I don't think that we needed to live there more. To other readers, maybe it wouldn't feel as active, not saying that other readers need that violence, but because it is more episodic, it may not feel like we follow Thurwar's through line as directly, and that we don't get to know these characters as intimately as some may want to. I argue that I think that there is a lot of commentary even going on with that when we think about how these characters are constantly under surveillance within this world and where they are allowed privacy and their inner thoughts and all of that. This book is very intentional. I thought all of those choices worked incredibly well for me as a reader, but there are other readers that those choices may not work as well for. That being said, I love this book. I'm still mad it didn't win the sci-fi category for the Goodreads Choice Awards. If you haven't read it, definitely give it a shot, especially if you like dystopias, if you like things like The Hunger Games. I generally don't. I don't generally gravitate toward dystopias. I've said it again and again. So that tells you, at least for me, that this book had something really interesting to say, and it made really interesting choices in terms of voice and structure, and I really appreciated how the whole thing came together. And then continuing our trend of something I said I don't like becomes one of my favorite books of the year, we have Lone Women by Victor Lavelle. This is a speculative Western. It is classified under horror, but I don't really consider it horror because the reveal of the kind of monster in the closet, so to speak, happens about midway through the book. So it's much more metaphorical, and it is dealing with horrors, but not the horrors that you would generally think of in terms of like supernatural monsters. Rather, it's the idea of the horrors of one, small communities, small isolated communities, and prejudices, how prejudices, especially racism, can run rampant in places like this, the kind of hypocrisies in places like this, and just the imagery in this book was so masterful. It really illustrated this idea of vastness and managed to instill this kind of simmering anxiety in everything, and there are scenes that have stuck with me since I read it earlier this year, which is really saying something, I think. And the character work was excellent because we really were following these women who had been cast out by mainstream society, but looking at what community building is and where communities stand strong. And it also succeeded in just these gorgeous mental images, mental pictures, like I said, but just from the initial visual of Adelaide dragging this trunk, this mysterious trunk that has her greatest shame in it, across the wilderness, and this idea of the desolation and the disappointment when she has basically been duped by this expansion railroad ad, and this idea that she is in this desolate place completely alone. I can almost still hear the wind that is whistling through this book, and I just loved it. It's not necessarily your traditional horror. It's not going to have any jump scares. At least I didn't have any jump scares, and I'm very easily scared, but it really makes you think. It's atmospheric, it's dark in its explorations, and it's more anxiety-inducing and terrifying in its kind of reflections of reality and what people are capable of, rather than any ghosts necessarily that are lurking in the corner. Keep ghosts lurking in the corner in the back of your mind while we jump into some real quick honorable mentions before we swing back to my favorite book of the year. First honorable mention goes to my friend Sarah Hallowell for What Stalks Among Us, which is a young adult horror that follows two teens as they enter a corn maze and start to see dead bodies that oddly resemble them, and how disquieting that is, especially as the corn maze seems to start to glitch. And haven't they been here before? This is a really great exploration of both trauma but also friendship and the strength of friendship and how friendship can get us out of really tough spots. So really loved this, loved the unique angle on this and how quintessentially Indiana it is. Also shout out to an excellent sophomore novel, Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. This is the author of The Hacienda, if you didn't know by chance, but definitely check this one out. This is such a unique spin on vampires and went in a completely different direction than even I thought. And it follows Nena and Nestor, two really close childhood friends who grow apart after a horrific accident when they are children. And Nestor thinks that Nena has been dead for years, and he comes back to find that is not the case, and just the complications that arise from that amidst this land grab from the United States into northern Mexico in the 19th century. So another historical setting and another novel that makes the vastness feel very tangible, and that is one of the things I appreciated most about this book. I also very much appreciated the growth it showed in terms of character development and the kind of tension and romantic tension between our two leads here in comparison to her debut, which I enjoyed because you know I love a gothic, but had some weaknesses that I think that this really tightened up. And then That Self-Same Metal by Brittany Ann Williams, which is a young adult Elizabethan fantasy. I just loved the Shakespearean setting here. I loved the tone. I loved that it felt like a romp. I loved that the Fae were our antagonists. I also just enjoyed that it was a lighter young adult while still dealing with heavy themes and topics, and that it was just reminiscent of some of the young adult I enjoyed when I was the age category. Now, on the opposite spectrum of that, we have A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid, which is a much heavier gothic atmospheric kind of exploration of grief and trauma in some ways, while looking at this through the lens of creation and art and what works can mean to us and what learning things about those works creators that may not align with our interpretation and experience of the work means. And as you can tell by all of the tabs here that you can maybe see, I really, really loved this book. The language here was gorgeous and lush and a little bit haunted in some ways, and just the kind of language I really, really respond to. While vastly different projects, this and Starling House really did live in similar realms to me when I was thinking about them based on the blurbs particularly, but also because they both involved this idea of some kind of literature or work that transcended and meant something to our protagonist and how that work lives in reality. So they are taking much different approaches to similar things, and to be fair, exploring different larger themes, though there is still some overlap there. So really, really enjoyed this book and eager to read the other Ava Reid I have on my TBR that I haven't gotten to yet. Additionally, on the romance front, we have The Duke Gets Even by Joanna Shupe, which is the, I believe, last in the Fifth Avenue Rebel series. This, well, recency bias, but I believe this is my favorite in the series, though I know the first isn't. Like in Knockout, this follows a couple that have been kind of circling each other for the previous books. Now, these two, we haven't had conclusive proof in the previous books that they are connected, just, you know, strong hints, but we have seen the Duke again and again as he was kind of tossed over by our other heroines in the series. Not all of them, but a couple of them, which is more than none for sure. And this Duke had come over to America to find a wealthy heiress for a failing estate, and he finds one, but it is a much different scenario than he initially planned. And so trying to win Nellie over and just the kind of push and pull between the two of them as they realize that they ultimately cannot deny their feelings, but are they suited in the long term, and can Nellie give up her independence? And I mean, look at this cover. Just look at this cover. It's a good cover. I almost forgot Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang in the honorable mentions. This book, while maybe not the most technically perfect of the year, has definitely stayed with me. I originally described it as Lakewood meets Goop, and it tackles the beauty culture and beauty standards as well as things like class and race and colorism through this very odd kind of speculative angle. It really is disquieting and interesting in its form, and I think of all the books that have explored beauty culture this year, this is definitely among the top for me. And with that, we are to my favorite book of the year. Did you guess what it is? Because it's clearly Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, because why wouldn't it be? This was my most anticipated book of the year, and it did not let me down, I am pleased to report. Additionally, just the scope of it is so massive it is kind of mind-boggling, especially having come from her short fiction because of collections like Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, collections that made me fall in love with Enriquez in the first place. But we also don't leave those collections behind because there is a connection in Our Share of Night to Things We Lost in the Fire, and one of the stories therein, my favorite, or one of my favorite stories from that collection. But this is just such an ambitious novel. It is probably the longest book I read this year because I didn't read as many hefty books this year as I have in the past, and I didn't feel lost in it. It kind of straddles between horror and literary fiction. Its real horrors, like with many things in Enriquez's work, are just as stark and terrifying as these kind of supernatural things that lurk on the side. There's a cult, there's intergenerational trauma, there is tension, there are very vivid and visceral images. It really invokes all of the senses in a lot of ways, like with her short stories, and manages to keep some really deft pacing. It does slow down in parts, but we are also being put in Gaspar's kind of state of mind within those parts, and it also moves between back and forth in different parts. So we're following Gaspar overall within this narrative, but we start with him and his father as his father is kind of making this journey, this trek, and we don't really know what exactly is going on, and we get to live in such language gems as the thing that was hiding at the end of the hallway was very frightened and wasn't dangerous, but it was old, and like all ancient things, it was voracious and wretched and covetous. Just that language is so delicious, and to be able to sustain that for a novel of this size is incredible. Like, it makes sense within short fiction how specific you have to be, but to take something like that specificity from short fiction and to translate it to something that is this long is incredible. And there is that specificity. There is the way that these different stories and sections weave in and out of each other. And there's this sense of terror and also this kind of cynicism that is completely rooted in the historical and political realities that really ground this book. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but needless to say, this book is dark. It doesn't have what I would consider maybe necessarily traditional jump scares, but it lives in kind of the darkest parts of the mind. And there are mental images here that you're just gonna have to sit with. They are in your head now. So if you're very sensitive to things like that, I would give you some caution there, but this is just an incredible book. I adored it. I should probably revisit it because there is so much going on in it. I know I missed things, and I'm almost tempted to go back and look at it against the body of Enriquez's work that we have already because of the connection I found just in one short story, so what exists maybe otherwise. I hope we continue to get her works in translation. I wish I were fluent enough to read this in Spanish because I can only imagine the depth and twists to the language, because if it's this good in translation, what is it in the original? My written review of the book just says, well, that's gonna haunt in unexpected ways. And I think the unexpected of it is particularly delightful. Delightful feels like the wrong word for this book, and yet, because I thought I knew what I was stepping into with this, and I absolutely did not. And while it fits within the conception of Enriquez's work that I have as a reader, it also continues to surprise and deepens everything, including how expansive just the world of this book itself is, and the way it kind of builds these layers between these real and supernatural horrors, and the way it blends them and combines them to look at things like class, and the way that class and politics intertwine. And while I know I am not as versed on the Argentine history that really informs this book as I could be, and I recognize that that has been a critique that some have had in my exploration of the book, I also understand that I'm not going to understand the full nuance of it because I have not lived it and I have not grown up with that living in the cultural memory. And so as strong and powerful and insightful as I find this book, I know it is still only a fraction. And it's also kind of hard to describe. The blurb talks about it being a road trip between a father and a son after the loss of their mother, but that is just the starting point, and it weaves in and out of time, backwards and forwards, as it follows Gaspar and his journey and the way that he is interwoven with this cult that he was born into and how this informs his entire entire life and how he is trying to escape this legacy, whether he realizes that is his legacy or not. So there is so much here. I know it's hefty, but if this sounds up your alley, I promise it is worth your time. I also recognize that it is not necessarily going to be up everyone's alley, and I'm almost kind of shocked that it's up mine because it is such quintessential horror in some ways, but again, it really bridges into that literary as well, and it is just so dark and imaginative, and the fact that this didn't win for horror really makes me sad because it's just something so fresh in terms of its voice and its perspective and the story it's telling and how it's telling it, and I am so glad that I got to read it this year. So those were my favorite books of the year. Let me know if there was any overlap between my favorite books of the year and your favorite books of the year, or just let me know what you read this year and loved, what made your favorites that I haven't read that you think I should tackle in 2024. But again, as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, but it really does help me out, like I said before. Most importantly, read something good, and here's to all the good reading coming in 2024, and yeah, bye.